Yeah, but look. What time is this? Good afternoon. We're going to get started with our final session. So I would invite everyone to please come into the room. And if you know of people who would like to be in the session or are outside, please call them in. We'll use you as ambassadors. Good afternoon. It's just past 3:15 and we're on a schedule to have about 45 minutes starting in a minute, I guess, from now to engage in what I think will be a stimulating session. And hopefully you're not scared of it because it's called the Valley of Death. And this wasn't because Halloween was a few days ago. It is a real term, as we're going to hear. My name is Sohail Hussain. I'm a professor of pediatrics at Stanford University. I'm a pancreatitis basic science translational investigator, and I also serve as co-chair of today's single topic symposium. It's my privilege to co-moderate the last and we hope most exciting session with Dr. Venkata Ashkantala, who's an assistant professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins and a clinical investigator in pancreatology. In these 45 minutes, Venkat and I will moderate a panel discussion with 4 esteemed panelists on the topic of traversing the Valley of Death. Again, the Valley of Death may seem like a sullen topic, but the goal of this session is to first tell you about what it is, and secondly, how you can successfully traverse this valley that many have unfortunately left their carcasses in. We will focus the discussion on drug and device development as it relates to pancreatic disorders and provide insightful case examples and helpful real-life tips from the distinguished panel to successfully traverse this valley. We don't envision in this 45 minutes the opportunity for Q&A, but if that happens, great. The panel will be available after the session and I presume during other parts of the APA to meet offline. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel. Dr. Erica Lyons, do you raise your hand? Thank you. Is an associate director for therapeutic review at the Division of Gastroenterology and the Center for Evaluation and Research with the US FDA. And it's great to have our FDA representatives with us at this meeting. Dr. Diane Simeone is the Perlmutter Professor of Surgery at NYU and the director of the Pancreatic Cancer Center. She's the chair of the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network, or PanCAN, and the chair of its National Scientific and Medical Advisory Board. And as you heard earlier today, if you were here for the morning, she's a leader of Precision Promise. Dr. Vikas Dudeja is a tenured associate professor of surgery and director of the Division of Surgical Oncology in the Department of Surgery at the University of Alabama. And Megan Golden is co-director of Mission Cure, a nonprofit using outcome-based financing, impact investing, and drug repurposing to cure chronic pancreatitis, a devastating disease afflicting her younger brother, who's in the audience today. And I'd like to now pass it on to my co-moderator, Dr. Venkat Ashkantala.
Thank you, Dr. Hussain. The first set of questions will be on understanding the valley of death. And since FDA has an important role in helping us traverse the valley of death, we will direct the questions to our FDA representative in the panel, Dr. Erica Lyons. Dr. Erica Lyons, can you help us understand what is the valley of death and what is the role of FDA in helping us traverse this?
Oh, absolutely. So you've heard it much more eloquently than I could state it already today. That the valley of death refers to the gap between the bench and the bedside, where drug development programs go to die. Unfortunately, we do know that 80 to 90% of early trials or early studies will not progress to studies in humans or clinical trials. And of the studies that progress to phase 3, approximately 50% of those will fail. So this is a very challenging space. And aside from going on about what it is, I'd like to highlight some factors that influence whether or not you end up in the valley of death or whether you may emerge from the valley of death. These factors are intrinsic. Hypotheses can be either poorly supported or underdeveloped. They're occurring in silos, which may not have the benefit of contribution from the larger community of pancreatitis experts. There's also a very high false discovery rate when you come to preclinical data, which can be from limited external validation in those areas. You have poor reducibility of results. You may have statistical hypotheses that are misguided. And as we just heard, there is a limited ability of those findings in animal models to translate to what could be promising findings in human studies. Additionally, there are extrinsic factors. Without an established path, industry is cautious to engage. And with that comes a paucity of funding available to really promote drug development in this area. It is a terrible conundrum where you end up with no path, so no funding, but then no funding, so no path. And that can be very challenging and very frustrating. Additionally, we have patient factors that we must consider. There's a hesitancy to enroll in clinical trials for pancreatitis. We have all faced recruitment challenges as we discuss a promising trial with a patient that seems well suited and well fitted for the trial, and then they say, no, thank you. For this, we need to look at those factors. Is it patient burden? Is it going to be too burdensome for the patient based on the requirements of the trial to travel from study sites to get additional screening tests done? And there's also, despite excellent efforts from patient advocacy groups, there is still a stigma surrounding pancreatitis within the medical community with our misuse and mischaracterization of these conditions, that patients and their caregivers feel as if they enter a trial, they're going to be labeled with alcoholic pancreatitis that we must get rid of. Other issues from an intrinsic factor is the siloing of the research. I had a mentor that spoke on and on about the file drawer conundrum, in which publication bias really limits the transfer of knowledge and the transfer and the generalizability of findings. If you don't know that something has failed in the past, you are much more likely to try it again. And Dr. Stimignon spoke about that earlier this morning, and I just echo that. Additionally, with that, there is a huge need for consensus and collaboration that would elevate the prospects and the design of the trials at early stages in order to facilitate their transition and potential applicability to human studies. The last area that I would like to focus on is the factors that are specific to pancreatitis. As we all know, it's a very highly complex disease course, has a heterogeneous set of etiologies and variable and very diverse natural history and clinical manifestations that we must deal with. Also, with the outcomes that are available to assess now, it's challenging because we have outcomes that may or may not be directly correlative or predictive or established or validated. And on the other hand, we have outcomes that are too hard to assess or too difficult or just unfeasible to incorporate within a clinical trial setting. With pancreatitis, unlike pancreatic cancer, that all-cause survival is not something that we're able to capture within the realm and scope of a clinical trial that is able to be completed. So with all of those factors kind of outlined, that's where transitional research comes in to shuttle well-formed, well-thought hypotheses that generate data which can be translatable to potential human implications through the valley of death, which I'd like to turn around and hopefully make the pressure test for what we should devote our collective research energy, interest, and available resources to turn it from the valley of death to the valley of hope.
Thank you. That was very helpful listening to you and getting the FDA perspective. So for us investigators, how do we engage effectively with FDA? So what are the platforms like pre-IND meeting or something else?
Oh, certainly. So I'll step back just a bit there. So with the FDA, I have to laugh. Phil Hart at lunch said, you know, I really learned that FDA is not that scary. So we do want to emphasize that we're very welcome and eager to engage at every stage of drug development, whether that is pre-IND, so investigational new drug application, where we may have preclinical findings or a hypothesis, to pre-IND, where your study theory has been a little bit more developed through the actual clinical trial phases and beyond. So with that, we encourage you to benefit from the availability and the opportunity to partner with FDA. We do have a wonderful resource opportunity and a unique perspective of having that really 10,000-foot view. Seeing clinical trials across multiple therapeutic areas has given us the benefit of perspective of knowing not only what roadblocks, pitfalls, potholes, challenges may come up, but also what paths have been successful and how perhaps not related disease areas, but disease areas which struggle in the same ways of pancreatitis, how they've been able to overcome those challenges. We also have a role in promoting collaboration, and that has been emphasized so very, very well here today. Independently, you can do so much. You can do so much at your center, you can do so much at your institution, you can do so much with your group that has been coordinating on one specific trial. But in a scenario where everyone is speaking the same language, has this access to data, has really just radical collaboration and transparency in what they're doing, that benefits everyone as you move the field forward. And I see FDA as a role very much there with just encouraging the involvement and engagement of stakeholders across the entire purview of drug development, including patients and caregivers and advocates, absolutely essential. Again, there are a lot of opportunities both within individual development programs, as you mentioned, the IND space, but also in a pre-competitive space with, you heard about the animal model qualification program just now. There's also a clinical outcome assessment qualification program, biomarker qualification, critical path initiative meetings, and a tremendous amount of resources available through the FDA website, through guidance development, all of that, which can help to light the path. We may not have the path. We're learning with you. We're keeping up with the science and we are so excited for what's happening, but it can light the path there. I know I'm running long. I'm so sorry. But again, I just want to emphasize that we all have the same goal. Our goal is to get therapies to these patients who are in desperate need. And by working together early, even though it may seem very enthusiastic about our recommendations, our goal is to facilitate the identification of treatment effects where one will exist. And I just encourage everyone to really take benefit of the opportunities and the experience that the FDA has available. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lyons. The next set of questions is related to the extent of the problem of the Valley of Death. And I'd like to turn first to Dr. Simeone. Would you comment on the importance of collaborative networks? You spoke about this morning to some extent, but could you give us an example of a product that was sure to fail, but then the collaborative network picked it up and brought it to its goal?
So not yet, but what I tried to make the case for earlier is this platform is now set up for people. And I'll give you an example. We were at the AACR pancreatic cancer meeting, and there was actually a PanCan scientific summit the day before of all extremely talented researchers, basic and translation researchers has done phenomenal work. And there were a couple of studies that end with the last slide, and they had discovered some new target or pathway, and they said, and now we're testing it in a clinical trial. And I'm like, whoa, time out. Like, you put all this effort in doing this science so carefully, and now you're just going to like throw it into patients in a not thoughtful manner, and you're going to kill this because it's not being done properly. And it's no one's fault. The thing is, none of us know everything, right? So we just have to understand what we're good at. And if we're really good at something, but someone else is really good at that other thing we need, then we need to engage others. And in academia, this part of it is not that well developed. And here, partnering with pharmaceutical companies and the FDA can be extremely helpful. We were talking earlier about biomarkers. We can say this and that about biomarkers, but in the end, it really matters what the FDA defines as a validated biomarker. So having that conversation early for all those pancreatitis conversations we had earlier, I don't know, it has a conversation, you know, the FDA is going to help you decide what your readouts are. And they do this in rare diseases all the time. So, you know, just leveraging expertise that's out there. And the thing is, people will come and work with you if you have a good idea. Don't underestimate your ability to bring people together if you have something good.
Great, thank you. And with that, opening it up to the panel, I know we're going to talk about repurposing specifically with an example from Dr. Dudeja, and we'll hear about the importance of patient advocacy. Would anyone like to comment on examples where they've seen a product rescued and it was sure to fail otherwise through, you know, collaborative work?
I'll take a stab at that. Not really of a project rescued in a way, but of a scenario in which a very challenging space was able to overcome the hurdles and really traverse that valley. And so I'll speak just a bit about progeria. So progeria is a rapid aging acceleration laminopathy disorder. And with that, it's ultra rare. These children die. They have no hope. So there is an extremely dedicated group of the Progeria Research Foundation, so partnering patient advocacy with incredibly talented and passionate investigators at Boston Children's and beyond, that was able to, through collaboration, not only identify and recruit the vast majority of worldwide cases with this disorder, but share data collectively, even transferring INDs amongst each other to go through several candidate therapies, some of which were wonderful, some of which were not, with intense collaboration and advice from the FDA, to the point where they were able to identify a therapy with a mortality benefit. So that program went from no hope to now an approved therapy with a mortality benefit, and research is ongoing. With that collaboration, this was mostly done with clinicians, researchers, as well as patient advocates and the population, until the trials were done. And then they brought in a pharmaceutical partner to facilitate with the application process, with shepherding it through, with ensuring that it was able to be manufactured. So I wish that had happened maybe a little earlier to provide them more resources, but what they were able to do was truly outstanding, and is a wonderful example of how it was the Valley of Hope.
And
I
I
think
want to add
Megan and then
something to that
Vikas.
because I actually know that organization and it was founded by the parents of a son who had progeria. And so that kind of speaks to the role of patient organizations. And my take on the Valley of Death, Mission Cure is a patient-led advocacy organization dedicated to developing effective therapies for chronic and recurrent acute pancreatitis. The Valley of Death is really a problem of financial incentives because the basic and the early translational research is funded by government, and funding for drug development is funded by private investors and pharma, and it's very expensive. And in between where the translational work happens is the Valley of Death, and there is no funding, systematic large funding in that area. And that work is often too repetitive or not innovative enough for the academic researchers or NIH and too risky for private funders, but it needs to be funded. And what we need is a funding source that incentivizes improved patient outcomes. You'll notice that that doesn't exist in the current kind of scheme of funding for drug development. Not to say that the people in the party in the different stakeholder groups don't want to improve patient outcomes. That's why everybody's there, but it's not the financially incentivized.
Thank you. And Vikas.
So I was going to talk about this when we talk about my piece, but I have an example of not a rescue, but a redirection. So we were trying to, as I will mention, that we are trying to develop pirfenidone, which is a drug approved by FDA for treatment of IPF. In our animal models, it was very effective in improving outcomes in acute pancreatitis. But the problem is that the drug is, first of all, oral. And second problem was that later on, we found that it was actually had not only an anti-inflammatory role, but also a very intense anti-fibrotic M1, M2 role. So in our discussions with FDA, actually, they suggested that, have you looked at it in recurrent acute pancreatitis and chronic pancreatitis? And we, in fact, were having that discussion, because this looks great, but maybe with my collaborators, but maybe it should be a drug for recurrent acute pancreatitis. So based on that redirection, we have actually gotten an IND approved for recurrent acute pancreatitis as well.
So the lessons we're hearing about is don't do this alone, find the right people, don't think you can do it all. And so we're going to hear more about repurposing now.
I have a follow-up question on this, Dr. Lyons. So we heard about the small sample size. We heard about some incentives for funding. And in pancreatitis, unfortunately, like majority of the diseases have very small sample size. Can you comment on orphan drug designation? Because I developed a drug device combination to treat pancreas necrosis, and it's a very small sample size. So when I was talking to industry partner to eventually take it to patients, they were very interested in applying for an orphan drug designation for all those incentives. Can you talk more about it?
Sure. So orphan drug designation is just one of the available FDA programs that has been implemented to really promote drug development in spaces that either may not be attractive for industry to pursue, or in which a need is urgently just not present. There's not a product to meet a need that's urgently present, excuse me. So orphan drug designation is something that a condition is eligible for and a program is eligible for if it affects less than 200,000 Americans. So it seems as if that is either a too high or a too low number based on who you ask. But the available incentives are listed there. You can go to the Office of Orphan Products website and kind of see what that is there. I'll diverge a bit and just touch base on some other programs that are available there. We interact with breakthrough therapy designation, in which something has been promising, typically with some clinical data to support it. Fast track designation is another one. So I could list all of the special programs and incentives that have happened recently, really to promote drug development in this area. But the reason for me to list them is to say that we are seeing benefits from that. We're seeing an uptick in not what we would consider, traditional approval kind of pathways where we have these very large, replicated, huge phase 3 trials to ones where the approach has been a bit more nimble, a bit more feasible to accomplish based on the limitations of the population. And I credit some of those programs that I named with that recent change that we are seeing.
Would you just mind elaborating on everybody? Because I think it's a little still a lack of clarity for our field. If something gets a fast track designation, it's not approved, but what does it mean? Does it just position that company to get more money, to accelerate the pace? Does it? Maybe you can explain.
Yeah, I apologize. I forget. And here I am speaking how we all need to have a common language, and then I'm talking reg speak. So I apologize for that. But a fast track designation is something that programs can apply for within the context of an individual development program. And what that is, it's part of an expedited program. There's a wonderful guidance document that describes it in detail. Programs with fast track designation can apply for priority review at time of application submission, as well as other opportunities for additional collaboration. Breakthrough therapy kind of ups that ante, and it decreases the time in which FDA will return comments to you, review. It's something that we've put in place as this potential therapy, or this therapy has the potential to do something wonderful. So we are going to put more resources behind it, more intense communication and collaboration, advice given in order to really facilitate development. And that's how we see our role. I cringed a bit when someone said the FDA limitations and restrictions, because in our role, we do absolutely, our goal is to bring safe and effective therapies to people who need them. But more than restricting, it's ensuring safety while providing guidance and recommendation to improve the program based on the benefit of the entire knowledge of the FDA.
Yeah, going back to Dr. Dudeja, can you expand more on your experience with what you did with FDA? What pathway did you select?
So what Dr. Venkat is mentioning is that, as was mentioned, that our experimental studies had shown that pirfenidone, which is a drug approved for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, is in our experimental studies showed that it reduces the severity of acute pancreatitis. So we secured funding in collaboration with Dr. Shanti Bege at Mayo from Department of Defense for a clinical trial. So so we had actually a very detailed interaction with FDA, and initially it was very scary that I don't know, we are dealing with FDA, but actually it was a very helpful discussion. In fact, FDA moves pretty quickly. There's a 30-day window clock which is running, and they're actually firing questions at you at speed which you can't even, like, it's pretty fast. Pretty good communication, and with every questions that they raised, they did provide some suggestions that this is what we think it should be. What do you think about that? And then we were actually initially hoping for a IND exception because this drug has been in clinical use for 6 years for a different disease. But FDA felt that given that it was a different kind of population, because we were looking at acute pancreatitis instead of chronic disease, it was felt that an IND was needed. During the IND 30-day discussion, the FDA mentioned that I think we need to convert this to a pre-IND where we can have a detailed discussion. And at that point, we felt that the all hopes are lost and it's never going to get approved. But during the pre-IND, they gave us a very detailed list of questions. We responded. That came back with a very good suggestions that you change this, and I think it will be a approvable product, or we will be able to approve the IND. And then after that, we actually got an approval for the IND for that particular indication. Based on that actually communication, FDA did mention that try this also for recurrent acute pancreatitis or chronic pancreatitis situation. And that IND we were able to get approved within 30 days based on all suggestions. So the discussion with FDA was actually very fruitful and not scary at all.
I'm sorry, let me just add to that because I think that's a key point, but I do want to say that although we do have that mandate and that responsibility to determine whether or not things are safe, we're learning with you, with the emerging science and the emerging field. And so some of that dialogue, maybe explain this rationale to me, tell me more about this novel model that you've conceived, because we do seek to understand and we seek to really find the best pathway forward based on our experience and based on the science that you're looking at and your specific patient population.
Thank you. That's very encouraging to hear. And you briefly mentioned about IND exempt. So would you have taken IND exempt if you were going through that pathway?
So basically, we were collaborating with Dr. Vege, and when he had tried pentoxifylline in acute pancreatitis patients, it was felt to be much safer than pirfenidone. That's why IND exempt was offered. But absolutely, we would have taken IND exempt, but it was not offered to us.
So what are
based
the
on requirement.
advantages of IND exempt? Because we do clinical trials and use repurposed drugs, for example, in post-CRCP pancreatitis, rectal endomedicine that we use all the time.
I think, I mean, I would let Dr. Lyons explain that more a little bit, but I think IND exempt is if you think that it's such a safe intervention that you don't even need the whole IND process.
So an IND exemption is really not meant to be something that could potentially support a marketing application or an approval. And so with that process, there are a few certifications based on the Code of Federal Regulations, which is our law. We have to operate under the law. But with that, it's not posing a substantial risk to patients because the differences in the patient population or the dose or the exposure, that the trial is done well under an IRB, and that it's not seeking to really support approval of a product. IND exemption is a great process and a very beneficial way to go. However, you lose that kind of, I'm almost sad when we grant those because we lose that interaction. We don't have the continued opportunity to, review proposals, provide advice, do back and forth that we would if a product was studied under an IND. So I always cringe a little and I'm like, yes, you don't have to have an IND, but oh, please tell me what happened. So it's another process, but it is available. And it is an avenue by which drugs that have been approved can be studied in an alternative population if it's safe.
Thank you. Just a reminder to the audience, we'll take questions to the end if we have time. Going back to Megan, so you briefly mentioned about the patient advocacy groups and its role. Can you expand on it?
Thank you. Patient advocacy groups are playing a larger and larger role in drug development and in bridging the valley of death. And Congress, through the 21st Century Cures Act and the FDA, have made very clear that patient groups and patients should have a larger role. And then organizations like the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative are building the capacity of patient organizations to take a leadership role. And Mission Cure is fortunate to be one of the grantees of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So some of the things that patient organizations are doing are reviewing survey instruments and research designs, helping pilot data collection instruments in patient populations, providing guidance on patient-centered endpoints, what's important to patients and what's feasible, working with the FDA in partnership on endpoints and trial design, recruiting patients for clinical trials and research surveys, which we recently did with Maisa Mabuhaja here, and hosting biobanks of patient specimens, creating patient registries, even as Diane mentioned earlier, launching platform trials like the Precision Promise Initiative. And so Mission Cure is actually eager to work with researchers here in many of these ways as we pursue pancreatitis treatments.
And can you tell if there is any financial role for these patient advocacy groups? And
there can be, but I talked a minute ago about the kind of gap in financial incentives, and it's a lot of money that's needed to build kind of proof of concept and enough evidence that a therapy will produce a very large return that will enable a private company to invest in it. And it's not going to be patient organizations that are filling that gap for two reasons. One is it's not just, especially for diseases that affect people who don't have high incomes or that affect small numbers of people. We can't expect every disease organization for their patients to fund their own drug development. But the second reason is that it's a large magnitude of funds that are needed. And if you look at all the money that comes from foundations in this whole ecosystem, it is a tiny fraction of what is coming from government and private sector. And so I think that the likely sources are more going to be government or private funding sources. For example, impact investors is one. We at Mission Cure have recruited some initial investors who want to make a return on their money, but also want their money to do good in the world. And this is a kind of a growing group of people generationally. The millennials and below really want their money to make an impact. And there are investments to be had there. And we really think that we've piloted this with chronic pancreatitis therapies, but think that it really can grow. And then one example of government funding is the new ARPA-H, which is the health version of DARPA, which got passed and launched this year. And it's going to have somewhere between $2.75 and $5 billion in the federal budget in fiscal 23. And that is specifically to do the types of investments and things that could one day be commercialized, which seems to be actually a perfect fit with the Valley of Death.
Thank you. Going back to our FDA representative, how does FDA look at these patient-centered outcomes? Because often in pancreatitis research, it's tough to meet the hard outcomes more because of the limitation with sample size.
Oh, certainly limitation of sample size and feasibility of implementing hard outcomes within the scope of a clinical trial that's able to be performed for pancreatitis. So patient-centered outcomes, and that's another role of FDA that I should have mentioned in response to that earlier question, is that they're a wonderful opportunity to really capture and utilize the patient voice in order to inform drug development. With that, we view that as data that, if systematically collected in a way that not only enables the concept of interest to be measurable, but the results of that assessment to be interpretable. We have had those support approvals based on a symptom assessment in combination with other metrics in some cases and not in others. So with that, FDA with patient-focused drug development initiatives has a huge push on really helping folks to craft and create clinical outcome assessments that can be used for regulatory purposes. There's a disconnect occasionally between instruments that are suitable for clinical practice use, and then when we go to look at them from a regulatory perspective, it's challenging to translate that to a measurable benefit that you can quantify. So there are a lot of resources there. FDA is very involved and invested in that, and I can follow up with some additional resources after the meeting. I could talk on it for days.
Sure.
Maybe
Thank you.
one example.
Please.
So, you saw I presented this platform, and if a company decides they want to come in with a therapeutic, the way it was built is they come in and it can go all the way to the end, or it can fall off at some point if it's not effective. But we still wanted, there was a certain price point with that to go all the way from the beginning of phase 2 to the end of phase 3. I think the price point for that is something like $21 million, which sounds like a lot, but actually is not very much considering the cost of doing phase 2 and pausing and doing a phase 3. That being said, if you look at how drug company budgets are decided, it's usually on a year-long basis. And so a company might not be able to commit to that. So what we asked the FDA if they'd be willing to do is if we could de-risk it and just have a 30-patient run-in where a company for, a more modest amount, let's say around 2 million or so, could enroll and they could get 30 patients and that and then there would be a pause after the 30 patients of 60 days where they could make a go, no-go decision. So here, the company, even though there's not that much clinical data that's accumulated at that point, at least they get a sense of safety and there's nothing that would be surprising. And so the FDA said yes. And in fact, we had a number of those discussions, like you heard me talk about giving patients more than one treatment and both treatments potentially accounting for overall survival, never done before. And our statisticians thought of it and the FDA said, I think that could work. So, and that's, and really the basis of those two things was really based on like, what do patients need and want? And then if you take the other key stakeholder, which is the drug companies, how do you lower the activation energy to make this happen and de-risk it for companies to come in with a therapeutic for disease that, there might be a higher failure rate than they might otherwise.
Megan, you wanted
Yeah,
a brief response.
I just wanted to make sure everybody knows about an initiative that we're undertaking in collaboration with the CPDPC consortium, being led by my colleague Lola Rahib, if you can raise your hand, which is coming out of Pancreas Fest and also the discussion this morning. I think people agreed that there's a need for a set of patient-centered outcomes that can be used for chronic and recurrent acute pancreatitis trials. And so we have done some work through surveying patients and other research to identify a set of domains and are going to go through a Delphi process to survey providers and patients and family members to identify which ones are most important. And then we'll work with the FDA to make sure that they get developed in a way that's suitable for clinical trials.
Thank you. When a show comes to the stage, that usually isn't a good thing, which means that we've got to end. But I've been told that we actually have maybe 1 or 2 extra minutes just because we started 1 or 2 minutes later. And I think one of the take-home messages that I have received is that you can negotiate with the FDA. So this isn't a hostage situation.
Within reason.
Reasonably. And so with that, let's just end. And I apologize to those who came up to the podium and that we could not entertain questions or comments from the audience. I know many of you have burning questions or comments, but remember, this is a meeting for another 3 days. And many of our panelists, hopefully all of them, I don't know, will be around, but their emails are also available and they are accessible. So let's end with what we'd like to call a round robin. And I was going to say 60 seconds, but maybe 30 seconds. What's the take-home message to our audience from each of our panelists? And we'll just go, sorry.
Very quickly before that, Sohail.
Yeah.
And I want to actually thank APA. I want to thank APA for organizing something like this because this is very educational for helping us understand FDA's perspective and exploring and understanding experiences from different people for Traverse the Valley of Death.
So my parting thought is that patient organizations like Mission Cure can help bridge the valley of death if you take advantage of what we can offer and work with us as partners.
I'll say my closing thought is that potentially the best way to de-risk and incentivize development in this space from folks that are not in this room is to show them that you have consensus and the ability to collaborate and work together and be transparent about your data. Also with eligibility criteria outcomes, that makes this space something that is not quite so mountainous to overcome.
I think my parting thought would be that even though as a pancreatitis community, we are lagging behind many other, for example, liver and inflammatory bowel disease, but that actually offers an opportunity because, there are many pathway inhibitors which are actually currently being developed for many other diseases, which can be repurposed. For example, our studies have also shown that, Notch inhibition can help in recurrent acute pancreatitis kind of animal models, and Notch inhibitors like gamma secretase inhibitors are being developed for desmoid. So we are actually in communication with the company to fund those research because still in that time where they can actually make money from all this. So I think that's an opportunity.
Yes, my comment would be, if something isn't working, don't be afraid to rethink your strategy to tackle a problem. And again, the point is if you can come at a problem at a larger scale with a group working together, it adds a lot of power to be able to solve it.
Great, thank you. So well said. Just as we end, let's give, and while right after the applause, please also bear with me for a couple of announcements. Let's thank our moderator, Dr. Wincat, as well as our distinguished panel for such a wonderful job. And now we're at the end of our satellite symposium. There are a few announcements, but first and foremost, is Aida here? Yes, so Aida, I wanted to especially thank Aida for co-chairing the Satellite Symposium, Ashok for all of the oversight, as well as our staff members from the APA and the committee that really led to the speakers, the moderators, the type of format for today, including Eileen, Duraj, and Anirban, who were mentioned earlier in the morning. And so let's give a round of applause to them. And it's been a privilege to co-chair this with you. There is a survey, so you can rate us, just like, on Yelp. A survey for this satellite symposium, as well as for the meeting. And I'd like to put in a plug that there's a survey about the APA. If you are an APA member since the last 1 year, you would have received it. If you joined just at the time of this meeting, you will receive the survey. Either way, if you haven't filled it out, and especially trainees and PIs, please encourage your trainees. We want to hear from you about how we can make the APA a more fulfilling organization with added value. And the last announcement is that you get a break for a few minutes, and then at 5 o'clock, there is the Hirschberg Symposium here in this room. So thank you very much, and one more round of applause. And importantly, a reception after the symposium. Yes, Miklos mentions that there are certain drinks available